Second World War. What if the United States and the Soviet Union fought alone against the Axis, without the British Empire? In this situation, what would happen on the Eastern Front, now the only front for the Germans? And would the United States be able to defeat the Japanese Empire without British help? Will we see US Marines in Stalingrad, given that the Normandy landing is impossible? What will happen in the Balkans, China, Atlantic? It will certainly be a completely different war. The World War II began on the 3rd of September 1940, with the declaration of war on Germany by France and Great Britain after the German-Soviet intervention in Poland. For about 10 months, on the Western Front, there were only a few skirmishes, a couple of naval clashes in the Atlantic, and aerial bombardments. On April 9, 1940, however, Germany launches Operation Weserübung, the invasion of Denmark and Norway, to prevent the Allies from blockading Norwegian ports. The British and French contingents sent to Norway are quickly defeated. In Great Britain, many people are dissatisfied with the way Prime Minister Chamberlain is conducting the war. On May 8th, Chamberlain is forced to step down. In our timeline, Winston Churchill was elected. He chose to fight Germany to the end, and by end we mean the end of the British Empire, end of the status of world power, and bankruptcy. But the first choice as new Prime Minister was not Churchill. King George VI preferred Lord Halifax, former Viceroy of India and current Foreign Secretary. Lord Halifax was more keen to make peace with the Germans than Churchill. In your timeline, Lord Halifax rejected the offer, so the job went to Churchill. But let's suppose that, in this timeline, Lord Halifax accepts and becomes the Prime Minister on May 10, 1940. Lord Halifax intends to continue the war, but the same day, the Wehrmacht launches a massive offensive codenamed Fall Gelb against the Netherlands, Belgium, and France, cutting off France's forces, along with the entire British Expeditionary Force. By the end of May, 400,000 soldiers are surrounded at Dunkirk, and the evacuation is difficult. It is a disaster. Halifax believes that, in order to preserve the empire, Britain must seek a negotiated peace with Germany. Chamberlain, who effectively holds the balance of power, supports Halifax and thrown his influence in favor of negotiations. At the beginning of June, with the intermediation of Roosevelt and Mussolini, there is an armistice. Hitler never was interested in a war in the West, so he could concede mild conditions. When Hitler said to Britain, peace or face destructions, he meant that a war would have devastated Europe, and actually he was right. The peace conditions. Germany will slowly withdraw from Norway, Denmark, Netherlands, and Belgium. Part of the Maginot Line, which was useless from the start anyway, must be dismantled. End of the British blockade. France will not accept any territorial loss, so Alsace remains French, and to save the face there will be a formally independent Poland, but a Poland under German occupation and deprived of the territories that had belonged to Germany before World War I, in addition to those invaded by Russia. It would be difficult to ask Stalin to return them. But Hitler has demanded another condition for peace. In his eyes, the only important one. British must assure to play no further role in the European conflicts. This condition allows him to concentrate all his military might against the Soviet Union. Between September and October 1939, the Soviet Union annexed the Baltic republics. On November 30th, 1939, it attacked Finland. In July 1940, the Soviet Union occupied Bessarabia. However, the Red Army's ineptitude in the Winter War against Finland convinced Hitler that it would be possible to easily defeat Soviet Union. Meanwhile, in Asia, China and Japan are at war since 1937. China is also torn apart by a civil war between nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek and communists led by Mao Zedong. The United States imposed trade embargoes on various resources, demanding that Japan withdraw from China. After the peace, Europe slowly returns to normality. In France, Reynaud remains head of the government of a fully independent France. There will be no Vichy nor Pétain. In Norway, the king returns to power. Quisling remains an anonymous Norwegian politician. The Axis Pact continues to grow. Hungary, Romania, Slovakia, Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia. In this situation, there will be no pro-British coup, and Yugoslavia will remain in the Axis. But something else has changed in Europe. In the East, Germany and the Soviet Union are face to face. United States, led by Roosevelt, maintain rather cold relations with the Axis countries, particularly Japan. The greater co-prosperity sphere of Japan overlaps with the greater co-prosperity sphere of USA. USA is the main financial and military supporter of China. The Lend-Lease program in support of China is approved, providing for the transfer of materials and military equipment produced in the United States. June 1941. The Axis forces are ready. 220 German, Finnish, Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian divisions, more than 4 million men, across a front extending from the Arctic Ocean southward to the Black Sea. In this scenario, the Axis has several advantages. Without the coup in Yugoslavia, and with many months to reorganize after the Battle of France, the attack can begin a few weeks earlier than in our timeline. There is no war in the West, so there is no need to keep dozens of divisions in France and Norway. No Battle of Britain. The entire Luftwaffe can participate in the operation, not just 65%. Italy can offer additional frontline units and naval support, which is no longer needed in the Mediterranean and Africa. Therefore, at least 40 additional Axis divisions, approximately 500,000 men, could have participated in Operation Barbarossa. But the Soviets, seeing Axis forces massing on their borders, are not taken completely by surprise. Stalin will order the preparation of defensive positions, and the Red Army will be better positioned, with formations deployed in depth instead of crammed too close to the border. It's possible that the Soviets will be able to avoid many encirclements. In addition, Stalin would have ordered a partial mobilization. The Soviet armed forces have 3 million men and a reserve of 14 million people. However, France too was aware of the imminent German attack in your timeline. Changed nothing. The 1st of June, 1941, Barbarossa operation begins. From the very beginning, the situation for the Soviets is dire. Axis forces advance deep into the rear of the Soviet troops. The Army Group South captures Kiev on July and Kharkov on September. Rostov falls on the 20th of October. Crimea is invaded. Army Group North overran the Baltic lands, and on the 8th of August 1941 begins the siege of Leningrad. Army Group Center captures Minsk and Smolensk in late June 1941 before beginning a drive on Moscow. They arrive at the city's outskirts by September 1941. In China, the Japanese continue their slow advance, but are also contemplating other expansion strategies. The invasion of French, Dutch, and British colonies in the Pacific, rich of the critical resources they need. This idea, while brilliant on paper, is stupid since Japan has no way of defeating the European powers, especially if they aren't distracted by wars in Europe. In September 1940, there wasn't even the Japanese invasion of the French Indochina. France would have reacted very decisively. The other strategy of expansion is the Northern Road, invading the Russian Siberia. In the 30s, there were a series of border disputes along the Manchukuo and Mongolian border. In 1939, a full-out battle played out at Khalkhin Gol. The Japanese were defeated by Red Army led by General Zhukov. However, the Japanese continued to formulate war plans against the Soviet Union. The Soviets are now hard-pressed by Germany's devastating advance and seem at defeat's door. They moved their best divisions and a lot of tanks from the Far East to fight in Moscow. This is the opportunity they've been waiting for. The Imperial Japanese Army commits 50 divisions with 850,000 men and a major portion of the Empire's naval and air forces. The attack to Vladivostok begins on September 8, 1941, with a massive blow on the Ussuri front. It is followed up with another attack to the north against Blagoveshchensk. The Japanese 3rd and 20th Armies, supported by the 19th Division of the Korea Army, penetrate the border south of Lake Khanka to isolate Vladivostok. Simultaneously, the 5th Army strikes south of Iman. Many used the Battle of Khalkhin Gol as a reason the Japanese would be utterly destroyed. But at Khalkhin Gol, the Soviets were twice the size of the Japanese. In this case, the Japanese are numerically superior and enjoys powerful naval support and air superiority. With the long-range Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, which would have devastated Polikarpov 116 and anything else in the Soviet inventory. The Trans-Siberian Railway is within Japanese artillery range at some point of the frontier and is cut in several parts, blocking any reinforcements arriving from the north. Before October ends, Vladivostok is taken. At this point, the Japanese must stop. An invasion of Siberia, even just as far as Lake Baikal, is unrealistic. Japanese army has few trucks, no serious main battle tank, and no fuel. After the Amur Valley, it's nothing but a desolate, snowy wasteland for thousands of kilometers. A squadron of drunken Cossacks could delay a battalion's advance for weeks. Furthermore, the ongoing war in China precludes the concentration of troops in the Far East too much long. Vladivostok is not vital to the war effort of the USSR, as was Alaska for USA. Stalin still continues to move large numbers of Siberian divisions westward, regardless of any Japanese threat, doing in the Far East what the does in the West. Trade land for time, letting the Siberian tundra fight the Japanese. October 1941, European Front. Operation Typhoon, the attack on Moscow, begins. The Axis powers have no enemies in the West, nor are their cities being bombed. Life is easy. In your timeline, on December 5th, Zhukov, using the reserve forces, launched a sudden counterattack, pushing the exhausted German troops back more than 100 kilometers. In this situation, the counterattack failed, as had all the Red Army's counterattacks up to that point. The arrival of 20 well-trained Siberian infantry divisions from the Far East might prevent the fall of Moscow, but not the start of Stalingrad-style house-to-house fighting. December 1941. Moscow sees urban warfare. The attack on Soviet Union worsened even more the relations between USA and Japan, not because Roosevelt loves the Bolsheviks, but because he doesn't like Japan's expansionist designs. Roosevelt will never accept that Axis rules the world. The United States extend Lend-Lease to Soviet Union and ship large quantities of war material via Murmansk on its own ships. The Germans begin to sink American ships. American Navy begins to sink German U-boats attacking convoys. The situation is heating up. The United States is accelerating its rearmament program with 18 new aircraft carriers and 11 new battleships. The Panama Canal is closed to Axis navies. October 1941, President Roosevelt freezes Japanese, German, and Italian assets in the United States and imposes an embargo on exports of oil and other raw materials to all the Axis countries. These measures have a devastating effect on the Japanese economy. The Japanese has less than a 2-year supply of oil bunker fuel for the fleet. In Siberia, there is no oil. It's a post-war discoveries. The only oil available is in Indonesia, a Dutch colony. But any supply line from Indonesia to Japan would have to pass by the Philippines, an American territory at the time. So, the Philippines has to be neutralized. Since 1939, Roosevelt policy was to try to provoke Japanese and Germans into making something stupid, and the Japanese will make something stupid. December 7, 1941, 7:48 in the morning. A Japanese fleet consisting of 6 aircraft carriers launches a surprise military strike on Pearl Harbor. 4 American battleships are sunk, and 2,400 Americans are killed. On December 8th, President Roosevelt declares war on the Japanese Empire. In the following days, Germany, Italy, and the other Axis countries declare war on the United States. Now, this is a world war. What is the situation on the field? Axis on one side, Soviets, China, and USA on the other side. The Allied have more population, a larger gross domestic product, the money. It is what really wins the wars. USA alone is worth the whole Axis. Allied have more resources, above all, the oil, the Axis's Achilles heel. A large advantage on the seas apart from submarines. They produce twice as many airplanes, and a lot more tanks. So, Allied remains an advantage, even without the British Empire. However, China and Russia have parts of their territories invaded and have lost a significant portion of their forces. The situation is on a razor's edge. The Japanese rapidly capture the islands of Guam and Wake and the Philippines before May. Japanese hoped that, after a destructive first strike, America would not have the stomach for a long war and would choose to quickly negotiate a compromise, reconsidering the economic sanctions. Things are turning out differently. What will America do? It will begin to build weapons like crazy. Aid to the Soviet Union and China will increase dramatically. For now, it is limited to supplies, not personnel. But there is the problem of how to get the aid to Russia. Without Vladivostok and without Iran, since it is not possible to invade Iran without British help, the only available ports are Murmansk and the Arctic route to Arkhangelsk. The Arctic route is dangerous. About a quarter of the aid was lost. Murmansk is under siege. In 1942, the American fleet is still underdeveloped. Without the British, crossing the U-boat-infested Atlantic is difficult. The Soviet war economy will be adversely affected by the diminution of Lend-Lease, but it won't be crippled by it. They still have access to most of the raw materials required to carry out the war and the industrial capacity to use the materials. Obviously, without less Lend-Lease, Soviets would have to pull more men into their industry and farming. How would a world war in the Pacific unfold without the British Empire? The Japanese have the advantage of not having to fight the British, but USA also has no other theaters of operation besides the Pacific. Without the Southeast Asian theater of operations, Japanese operations shift toward Hawaii and the Aleutian Islands. Thailand, obviously, remains neutral. Landings take place on the islands of Kiska and Attu, followed by landings on other islands, for example, Unalaska, which is strategically important due to the presence of an airfield. From mid-1942, there are clashes between aircraft carriers in the cold waters off Alaska. The US managed to block a further Japanese landings while losing a couple of carriers. This loss matters little to them, given that from late 1943 onwards, they began producing the equivalent of the entire Japanese fleet every 6 months, along with 5 times as many aircraft. The Battle of Midway takes place in June 1942. The Japanese intend to occupy Midway Atoll, but the United States are aware of the enemy's move thanks to the deciphering of Japanese cryptographic codes. It is a disaster. 4 modern Japanese aircraft carriers are sunk. In the Aleutians, the naval clashes and the battles between U.S. Marines and Japanese forces continues, with heavy losses on both sides. Losses that Japan, however, could not sustain. Japan in this situation has even less oil. Before 1943, U.S. troops forced the Japanese to abandon the Aleutian Islands. Japan loses the initiative in the Pacific. Russian Front, 1942. If the Soviets managed to withstand the Axis's initial attack, they would begin to counter the Axis more effectively. The Soviet industry has been redeployed in Siberia, out of reach of the Axis air forces. The Axis logistics is severely overstretched, more than 1,000 kilometers away from supply bases. They still rely mainly on horses. A Soviet's counteroffensive in spring 1942 probably pushes the German armies away from Moscow. However, an Axis without bombardments, Balkans, British and Africa, is an entirely different beast. Just sending east the 11,000 Flak 88 used for air defense makes a great difference. The Germans do not collapse and withdrawn without huge losses. A front line is established between Ref and Vyazma. In June 1942, the Wehrmacht resumes its offensive in the southeast, with the aim of capturing the oil fields of the Caucasus. Declaring war on the USSR was not about Lebensraum. The Germans had no interest in more lands to grow potatoes or raising chickens. The main reason the German army invaded was for the oil. On July, the Germans launched their assault on Stalingrad. A fierce urban battle breaks out, reducing the city to ruins. It is likely that the Soviets would have won anyway, managing to drive the Germans away from the city in 1943. But there is no Operation Uranus, which overran the German-Romanian defenses on the Don and routed the weakened Axis forces. Therefore, von Paulus's German Sixth Army is not lost. In the Atlantic, apart from U-boat attacks on American convoys, the Germans and Americans essentially ignore each other. It is unlikely that American aircraft carriers would carry out air raids on German territory, just as it is unlikely that German battleships would bombard the American coast. The Germans still have dangerous battleships like the Bismarck, not sunk as the battle never happens. Admiral Scheer and Tirpitz are some of the best battleship of the world, but they will keep them close to their own seas. The U.S. Navy naval blockade is largely ineffective since the Germans can bring in as much goods as they want via the Mediterranean. Europe is outside the range of the B-29 from America, but they will never take off from bases in Siberia. The United States is protective of its advanced technology in the field of heavy bombers. The Soviets never received heavy bombers, neither under the Lend-Lease program. So there won't be any B-29, B-17, and B-24 over Europe. Starting in 1943, the first American soldiers begin arriving in the Soviet Union. Soviets for sure do not need infantry. However, support is helpful, since opening a second front in Europe without Great Britain is impossible. During World War II, in your timeline, over 1.5 million American soldiers were deployed to Europe. In this timeline, there will be far fewer of them, maybe 300,000, up to 400,000. They will remain to defend Murmansk, and many may fight in Leningrad and Moscow. It is unlikely that they will be deployed to Stalingrad, given the logistical difficulties of supplying them so far from their port of arrival. Their commander will be Eisenhower. American soldiers will remain under direct U.S. command. They will not be integrated into a Soviet front. Among the divisions that could see action in Russia is certainly the 101st Airborne Division, the 82nd Airborne Division, the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Armored Division. The 10th Mountain Division could be used in Finland. One of the generals will certainly be Patton. They will be better equipped and supplied than the Red Army soldiers. They will have thousands of Sherman tanks. Americans did not lack cargo ships to carry them at Murmansk. However, on the Eastern Front, a Sherman tank might face difficulties against Axis guns, which was accustomed to destroying monsters like the KW-1 and the IS-2, and there could be heavy losses. The Eastern Front is probably the most dangerous and bloodiest front in history, with fanatical soldiers on both sides. Little inclination to take prisoners, extreme environmental conditions, vast spaces, tanks as big as houses. Things will go much better in the skies. There will be the P-47 Thunderbolt that, however, underperformed in the low altitude, the more common combat zone in the east. Better the P-39 and the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. Without the British, the P-51 will not exist or will have low performances. 1943. In the Pacific, the Americans definitively go on the offensive thanks to their overwhelming industrial superiority. Japan, in 1943, produced 1 aircraft carriers and 1 escort carrier. U.S. in 1943 produced 15 aircraft carriers, 3 fleet carriers, and 12 escort carriers. And in the last part of 1944, U.S. pumped out escort carriers at a rate of nearly 1 per week. Japan will not receive much aid from Italy and Germany, but the exchange of data and technology will be easier, since the U.S. Navy has virtually no presence in the Indian Ocean. Japan was interested in the Messerschmitt Me-262, but only possessed photographs and rough cutaways. In this situation, they could directly study and flee an operational German Messerschmitt Me-262. A German rocket-powered interceptor, Messerschmitt Me-163, was disassembled and sent to Japan in 1944, but all submarines carrying the aircraft were sunk. In this timeline, they will arrive in Japan. In 1943, a delegate of Japanese officers was sent to Germany to acquire 1 Tiger I. The Tiger was disassembled and prepared for shipment to Japan. But Japan did not possess submarines capable of transporting the heavy components of the tank, so it never reached Japan. In this timeline, no need of submarines. The tanks will be sent using a normal ship. Meanwhile, British and French are watching the war, beer and popcorn in hand, continuing to rearm and sell tanks and aircraft to the Russians, but this time they will be paid for them. British public opinion is divided. The pacifists fear another massacre World War I style, while the pro-war elements fear the Nazi expansion. At the end, the appeasement factions could gain more importance since most of the people don't understand how the United Kingdom can have the slightest benefit from a war for Poland. France was quite humiliated but will not rejoin this war. They didn't even attack Germany in 1939, despite being the largest military of the world. They let Germany, Italy, Japan, and the Soviets kill each other. And if USA wants to join the party, even better. There may be even a 4-for-5 sale on guns to USA. By the end of 1943, there may be some Soviet victories. The siege of Leningrad is partially broken, while Soviet armored columns advance towards Smolensk and Bryansk. In your timeline, after Stalingrad, the Red Army began to overrun the Wehrmacht all the way to Berlin. But this is a different axis. Soviet armaments production increasingly outproducing the German war economy only because Axis countries were invaded, bombed, or both. In this situation, Axis industrial production goes essentially uninterrupted. There is no need to create the Atlantic Wall defenses. The greatest single resource drain, V2 program, is reduced. The Me-262, the world's first operational jet-powered fighter aircraft, appears earlier and in greater numbers. No need to keep forces in France and Normandy. The Polish cryptographers may not have gone to Britain, so the Enigma code, which was used by the Germans and Italians for all their communications, may not have broken. It is more important than many people realize. According to some estimates, cracking the Enigma code would have shortened the war by 2 years. So, it could happen that in mid-1944, something similar to the Battle of Kursk takes place somewhere, perhaps with the participation of American tanks. But this time, the Axis forces prevail, halting the Soviet advance. From this point on, the Red Army is incapable of launching further large-scale offensives against a full-strength Axis. In the Pacific, the Japanese continue to lose ground. On July 21st, U.S. Marines land on Guam. The invasion of the Philippines begins in October 1944. Okinawa is captured in June. Fighting continues in China, with American forces also involved, maybe in the campaign of Changsha-Hengyang. On April 12th, President Roosevelt died. He had brain problems, and Vice President Harry Truman succeeds him. The United States hesitate to launch an invasion of Japan, fearing the costs. In this scenario, the atomic bomb is not yet ready in August 1945. It was the British who provided the United States with the original scientific data that made the development of the atomic bomb possible. They did it only because they were clearly losing and desperately needed American aid. In this situation, the Tube Alloys Project, complete with all materials and scientists, will not be handed over to the Manhattan Project in the United States, along with other things like the early VT fuse and various radar developments. The Americans can develop them independently, but it means a delay of several months at least. In any case, it wasn't the atomic bomb that defeated Japan. What really defeated Japan was when, in August 1945, 1 million Red Army veterans wiped out the entire Kwantung Army in Manchuria in a couple of weeks, threatening to land in Japan soon. Since the Soviets are preoccupied with other matters in Europe, there will be no Soviet invasion of Manchuria. Without nukes, the US strategy will likely not involve an invasion of Japan, but rather a blockade aimed at strangling Japan and aerial bombardments. There's a landing in Formosa, and the US military effort is shifting to China. The war in the East has become a war of attrition and resources. The Red Army suffered immense losses, but so did Axis. It is now clear to everyone that the Russians will never reach Berlin, nor will the Germans reach Moscow. There has always been, even in our timeline, more or less secret talking between Stalin and Hitler for a separate peace. Stalin never trusted the Americans, and in truth, he didn't like the British either. His fear was that a long and grueling war would ultimately benefit those two nations. On the other hand, needless to say, the Americans don't like the Soviet Union, and they have no intention of helping Stalin to conquer half Europe. Most of the aid and troops have now been diverted to China. Hitler too is not opposed to peace, especially now that he has achieved many of his goals. On November 1941, Hitler indeed declared to a group of generals that a shared recognition of mutual inability to annihilate the opposing side would inevitably lead to a negotiated peace. In June 1945, an armistice is signed. This is followed by very lengthy negotiations. At the end, an agreement is reached, a sort of second Brest-Litovsk. The Soviet Union could lose the Baltic states, Belarus, Ukraine, and the new border could roughly follow Russia's current borders. There will be no war reparations or anything of the sort. The release of prisoners could take many years. In the East Europe, the war's over. A difficult peace begins. The war in the Pacific continues. It always was a separate war. Once the problems in Europe are over, it's possible that the Soviets will find a few dozen divisions and 1,000 T-34 and retake Vladivostok. The Kwantung Army is now just a shadow of what it was in 1942, reduced to a paltry 460,000 men. American forces continue to advance into China, using Chinese troops as cannon fodder when needed, while devastating bombings of Japanese cities continue. Many in Japan, including Emperor Hirohito, are convinced that the defeat is certain and the war must be brought to an end. It is very likely that this faction will succeed in gaining the upper hand over the bellicose military staff, who is determined to continue the conflict. In this way, the Japanese will secure more favorable terms. They will lose their territories in China, including Manchuria. Korea will become independent, but they will avoid military occupation and will keep their fleet. The signing of the peace marks the conclusion of the final chapter of the World War. So, we come to the end. Once the dust settles, let's give a look to the new world. The United States becomes the world's leading power. It was its manifest destiny since 1900. But it will not be the dominant world power in this multipolar world. The Korean War does not happen. Korea remains a united state inside the American sphere of influence. But there will be a larger and bloodiest Korean War in China between nationalists and communists that could last after 1950 and could cost the re-election to Truman. Since there is not the invasion of Manchuria, the Soviet forces will not leave their equipment to Mao. The additional U.S. supplies going to the nationalists during the Second World War and the involvement of American troops could make the nationalists more successful. The war could end with a divided China, as happened with Korea, with the nationalists obtaining much more than just Taiwan. With a nationalist China allied of USA, the war in Vietnam will end with an American victory. Relations with the Soviet Union would soon deteriorate, first and foremost due to tensions in China. Stalin could be removed from office, perhaps even before the peace negotiations with Germany. Mussolini will remain in place, as Franco in Spain. The UK would have needed to coexist with a more powerful Germany dominating Europe, but at least they don't have to coexist with the USA and Soviet dominating Europe, including Britain, and avoid the most spectacular decline of a nation in history. Britain retains the empire for a while, but the empires were no more profitable since 1850, especially Africa, so it would have been slowly dismantled as other European empires. India, however, will become independent, another manifest destiny. Hitler remains the German leader until his death. Germany begins to build its European Union that will probably be more efficient, with less bureaucracy, less immigrants, and less gay prides. Soon, all the world's major powers will have nuclear weapons, which will calm down many politicians. So, this is the new world.